Hello, my name is Matt Talbert, and I am the Senior Research Manager at ASCM. It is my pleasure to be your host for today's webinar on economic inclusion and supplier diversity. We have an amazing panel today, so allow me to introduce them. First is Mike Dang, who is a Senior Manager in the Supply Chain and Network Operations practice at Deloitte Consulting, LLP. He is also certified PMP and APIC CSCP. He holds an MBA in Supply Chain Management and an ME in Information Technology and a BA in Computer Science. Don Good is a principal with Deloitte Consulting LLP and leads the Coupa Alliance Global Group. As the global lead alliance partner for Coupa, Don is focused on expanding local market presence, increasing delivery capabilities, and fostering new relationships with Coupa. He also earned his MBA in Finance and Operations Management from the University of Texas. Next, we have Andre Sordi, who earned his PhD from the University di Genova in Italy. He is the academic director for the Executive MBA in Supply Chain Management and a clinical professor of Supply Chain Management in the Department of Supply Chain Management at the University of Tennessee. Finally, we have Wendy Tate, who earned her PhD from Arizona State University. She is currently the William J. Taylor Professor of Business at the Cheryl Massingale Faculty Research Fellow in the Department of Supply Chain Management at the University of Tennessee. So thank you all for joining us today. This is an excellent panel. So let's get started. ASCM is vested in the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion. We recently ran a study in collaboration with Gartner that was more at the workforce level. So this panel is going to take more of a macro view. So Andre, would you be able to give us an overview of what you all mean by economic inclusion and supplier diversity for today's webinar?
Yeah, sure, Matt. Thank you for having me and the rest of the group in this session, which is great. So before getting straight into the definition, let me give you a little bit of a background why this is important, why Deloitte and I started working on this initiative, this project, and joined with Deloitte. There are a lot of changes happening in the world, as we're all experiencing, especially in these past 24 months. There are changes in demographic. So what we used to consider minorities back in the days are, in 20 years, are becoming equal portion of society. An equal portion of society which is going to have different buying power. And then also new generations of consumers and employees coming onto the scene that have very different target desires and needs and aspirations from companies, both as manufacturers, service providers, or employers. And at the same time, we are assisting across the globe, not necessarily in this side of the world, but even in my side of the world where I'm coming from Italy in Europe. There's the polarizations of economic disadvantages, inequality in society is getting bigger and bigger. And COVID has just been a catalyst of that acceleration, with most of the diverse businesses being eaten by the pandemic in terms of economics. So if you put all this complexity together, the traditional supply diversity program that tackle and develop businesses with specific categories that are getting recognized, has been recognized for many years in a fantastic way, are not sufficient any longer to tackle those opportunities. So, supply diversity is the solution for a specific problem, a specific issue that we wanted to target. But the complexity of the issues that we are facing at the moment require a more holistic solution. And that's where economic inclusion comes to play. Economic inclusion is really the evolution of supply diversity, being able to tackle different aspects of society at the different levels, and therefore creating a holistic value through an ecosystem of diverse businesses that either are in the traditional categories or are across other categories or other geographies, And therefore, the conversation isn't any longer a US-centric conversation or a UK-centric conversation, but becomes a holistic global conversation in a world where complexity and volatility are both local and global at the same time.
So I just want to add a little bit to what Andrea was saying. And again, thank you, Matt and ASCM, for arranging this, because I personally believe this is a very, very important topic, and it needs to be discussed, and it really needs to be part of what organizations are talking about and in those C-suites at the top levels of the organization. So the big difference when we're talking about what's basic diversity moving into economic inclusion is that we have to understand, and we look at things sometimes and we think, well, okay, these are our categories of diversity, and so as long as everyone aligns behind those, then we're fine. But what's diverse here in the United States is not diverse in Australia, for example, where they have an Indigenous Opportunities Program. Well, they wouldn't count towards our diverse statistics if we went and hired these suppliers to be part of our supply chain. And there are other places the same where there are some categories that we use that just make really no sense in terms of these different populations. So we really need to step back and say, what is this typical diversity program and how can we move it to economic inclusion? And a lot of our research, that's what we've been focusing on in order to get these non-recognized populations, and in reality have more social and economic impact if we can incorporate more into our supply chains. So the diversity and hiring diverse suppliers leads to a number of really good things. And Andrea and I spent a lot of the last year talking to different associations and organizations about this. But these diverse suppliers were much easier. They were much more flexible. They could pivot. They're smaller. They have the opportunity to do things that our big, large suppliers didn't. So the diverse suppliers, in a lot of cases during COVID, actually helped organizations to improve and to meet the crazy demand that they were trying to meet. So diversity also, in a good sense, at least in the United States, allows for contracting with the government. So you will have to meet a certain criteria. That's another good reason why we need to do this. But I think a lot of what I've heard is that it's these suppliers are able to help you innovate because we get diversity of thought in our supply chains, and they will bring these varied perspective and thoughts to the table. So really, there's all good that comes of this diversity and inclusion programs. We're going to talk about some more of that as we go through today. So Don, I don't know if you have any other examples from practice maybe you can tell us about.
It's a good question, Dr. Tate. What I would say is the concept of diversity, you alluded to this, has really changed and aggressively changed for all the right reasons. And I do come back to something you alluded to during the downturn and the pandemic. It wasn't just that they were more agile, they were also local. And take a look at the challenges that the pandemic created. It laid bare the fact that our global supply networks, our global supply chains, have all forms of weaknesses, right? The levels of interdependence can't work when you're shutting down ports, can't work when you're shutting down borders. But when you have a broad enough and a diverse enough, I'll use that word, supply chain, you have the ability to take advantage of global economies and local economies. And I think that's, for me, moving beyond just a diversity statistic that the government uses for tracking purposes, and think about the diversity and the flexibility and agility of your supply chain, is really where you'll be able to see that. And that's what we saw, where companies really made strides, is pivoting. Those that could pivot did very well. Those that couldn't really struggled. And that to me has been one of the lessons learned out of the last 18 months.
Building on what Don was saying, I think there are two things happening. The changes in society that are requiring different approach, but from a business perspective, supply chain are looking for different solutions. So if you look for different sourcing solutions, those could be a replication of the same approach with big suppliers, or you can look to different solutions that provide creativity, innovations, and more resilience. And that's where supply diversity comes into play and turns into a social benefit, which generate economic inclusion.
Yeah, and I think that Andrea also mentioned about resilience. And I think resilience is really a key word trying to build into our supply chains, and these more diverse suppliers can help us with that. And Don mentioned a bit earlier about interdependencies within our supply chains. And you know, when you're thinking about a complete disaster or a complete shutdown, the more of that you have, the more connections that you have. Sometimes it's difficult to stop what you're doing, what the status quo was, and think through how can we make this so we can be more agile, more resilient, and more flexible. So a lot of positive things might happen with these diverse suppliers.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great and clear definition of economic inclusion from this supplier diversity standpoint and some of the programs that you touched on. There's a major sustainability component to it, as you mentioned. Also a major, I was thinking before you mentioned, Wendy, there's a lot of risk and resilience that comes into play as well. That's been a major topic coming out of the pandemic. But there's another element that some of our viewers might be thinking about, the investments and the resources that need to go into it. And while investors are moving their attention to social and environmental aspects, they don't want to feel the financial pressure of investing in such an initiative. At that end, it is an integral part of the triple bottom line. Andrea, you mentioned economic inclusion being a value creation effort. Someone on the panel maybe could expand a bit more on what these value generation opportunities are, how organizations are going after those, and what companies can do to remain profitable and still manage an economic inclusion program. And are there cost burdens associated with this?
Yeah, well, I think, thank you so much, Matt, that's actually a fair question, in terms for companies, they are trying to figure out, how to balance actually the cost and also the value, the benefits of the economic inclusion initiative. I think, Andrea mentioned a little bit earlier. So I actually also want to, kind of second what Andrea mentioned earlier. Before we actually, really go further to the actual cost and the benefit, actually we have to take one step back, to think about what is actually happening in the whole world, right? Don mentioned about the pandemic definitely creates some aha moment for us to think about this differently. But definitely the world is changing. First, and I mentioned briefly, the global demographic is fast evolving. So by based on the recent new census population projections, by 2024 or 2045, the minority will represent 50% of U.S. population, and then 20% for UK. So the minority in our mind today is not a minority anymore. And also, from a consumer buying power, and then 80% of the buying power belong to women, not men anymore. They are actually dominating how the money will be spent. And also there will be around a 4 trillion minority buying hours in the marketplace by 2045. So I think that's really plays a bigger role. And also think about the recent the next gen reckoning report. 73% of the younger generation, they said that they care more about a healthy and a diversified and a sustainable future. They actually are really willing to take more actions to protect that future. So I think that's all happening in the holistic market, help us to think about what the types of values from the economic inclusion program can bring on the table, because like it is actually very, very critical for company to think about the holistically what actually the economic inclusion program can present, like a bigger, a larger opportunity, to drive actually a holistic value proposition, especially for the supply chain functions, as Don mentioned earlier. By having that local availability, that's kind of like a huge game changer, like to help us out. So by taking about all this into consideration, and then to circle back our economic inclusion, the benefits of economic inclusion can have multiple different fronts. It's actually absolutely helped the company to think holistically. So the first, bigger benefit we have seen in the marketplace is actually generally have a strong company brand and the reputation. If they care about the society, the environmental, I think as we mentioned about, that's actually touched part of the triple bottom line. So the second one is actually, the economic inclusion is not just focused on like what is actually checking the box. It's actually give you the opportunity to grow your revenues, because you are attracting that younger generation, that the minority generation, that's going to give you the opportunity to increase your revenues growth, your profit growth. So, and also, like Andrew mentioned, that like probably I'm like repeating him, like as well as like Wendy, the agile and the resilient supply chain is absolutely very critical. With a much diversified supplier base, locally and globally, that actually not just like a positive impact on the social economic development, but also give you the flexibility to kind of like handle the disruptive situations you never forecast probably in the future. I think that's all these like benefits. However, I understand like the cost is also plays a factor, right? So on the other hand, one is actually comes into the investment on the types of economic inclusion, like initiatives. We generally see like the cost come from like a couple major buckets. The first one, absolutely, you need to invest like some personnel. You have to set up like a broader like operating model to kind of like cover economic inclusion. And then definitely there will be components of the technology investment to help you to capture that trend or fulfill that need, because you want to actually like have that technology as enabler. And then definitely there will be some diversified supplier development costs, because not everyone is mature enough. And also you want to actually constantly communicate out and increase awareness internally as well as externally. So I think that all those costs, kind of like, really play a factor in. I mean, we will talk probably a little bit later on, like, we actually, arrived in a very simplified formula, how to calculate the actual benefits as well as the cost, to actually show to the companies, what is actually the potential ROI you can bring on the table to your executives, to your board members. We definitely need to be on this journey. And I think that's like, what I have seen. And Don, I know that you actually have the privilege, and the position to see many different approaches across industries. How are the other different organizations and their supply chain in particular reacting to these kind of types of like economic changes, and how do they value this? Yeah.
Well, Mike, thank you. You hit on something that's very important that we see time and again. Companies, organizations, they didn't set themselves up to be altruistic by nature. They are economic concerns. They are there to provide a service to create value, but also to pay attention to their shareholders. And for how many years have we watched maximizing shareholder value really being about maximizing the revenue, reducing the cost to create the best margin? You alluded to it, and I think we're seeing it through all forms in society, that the way people view themselves, the way they view decision making is changing. And how companies invest themselves, how they support different initiatives, how they support society in general is now becoming even more important, and in many respects beyond what legacy leadership has paid attention to. It's not just a statistic to report to a government. I said that earlier. It is now, how do you create a new image for yourself? How do you allow the new buying power to see you as something that they're willing to invest their money with? And I think with that lens, you're seeing companies invest in local suppliers. Whereas before, the easy button was to work with the larger conglomerates, the ones that could give you a broad base of goods and services in one-stop shopping because you felt you were getting the lowest cost associated with that. The reality is the resiliency we talked about, the nature that companies are investing in local supply bases. That actually, you mentioned the skill set, the resource side of this. Let's not just focus on setting up a diverse supply-based program, but also think about how do engineers, how do sales executives, how do buyers, purchasing professionals all look at their local supply base as a means to reaching out to their market, not just a means to getting a specific good or service. And I think that cost is something that we're still seeing companies invest in because they're not really sure. That's a different skill set. It's a different muscle they're having to flex to be able to learn how to engage in those local markets. And I think we'll see that as the next shift over the next 10, 15 years of really growing that out. And what we're talking about here today is how do you quantify that? How do you put a value to that? How do you help people guide those investments the right way so they maximize, again, to the first point, maximize their investment while also being viewed in a more favorable way? And I think that's the trend we're seeing. No specific companies, because each industry actually has its own kind of supply network challenges, whether they're being sourced out of Asia or North Africa, or whether or not it's around talent and IP associated with that. They all have their different challenges, but they still will need this view.
And I think then the other aspect that the other way to say is that there's an increasing concern and focus on risk management. So seeing supply diversity as a way to solve risk management, especially in a post-pandemic environment where, well, we realize that risk is more than realistic. Companies are finding solutions, and supply diversity is one of those, to respond to supply risk management, to financial risk management. The S component of ESG from investors community is taking more and more weight into the evaluation of investment opportunity than ever before. And ultimately, from a sustainability perspective and profitability, sustainable profitability of the organizations, you really want to make sure that you're going to be competitive over time and avoiding, not considering those changes that Mike was mentioning before and those events that Don was talking about. It's kind of a kamikaze approach and killing yourself in terms of financial sustainability over the future. So I think it's, in any sense, what I'm saying is that, supply diversity might have been kind of a tick in the box and compliance opportunity elements back in the days, is becoming not a choice anymore. It's a must need to do.
We lost you at it's a must need to do.
Yeah, it's a must need to do, and the point of must need to do, then the questions that are coming next is, okay, it's must need to do, but do we have the capability as organization to do that? What does it need to change in our organizations? Do our procurement supply chain people need to have different skill set or different capabilities? What does it all mean? And that's the other point that Wendy and I have been spending a lot of time on trying to dig into, and finding some best practices around the world that might provide an heterogeneous approach.
Great, thank you, Andre. That's actually a good segue in some of the next topics that we're going to touch on. I know you all talked about the value. There needs to be a greater focus than just shareholder value, and it's something that you need to find a way to make a priority in your organization. Again, risk and resilience, even though that wasn't in the title of this webinar, that's a theme that's coming up, and that's important, and that's something that we learned from the pandemic. But now that we're getting a clear understanding that supplier diversity and economic inclusion programs it's more than just a tick in the box, as you say, Andre, for organizations. There's definitely a broader angle. And then reading through your recent paper, there's a great research paper from this team that came out from this. You worked together with procurement leaders on this topic. And you talked about 7 pillars, and you found a key for supply chain organizations to create the right capabilities to support a successful evolution to an economic inclusion mindset. Can you talk about these pillars?
Yeah, sure. So the first one is let me to describe the first one. Let me go a step back. We all love when we go out for dinner. We all love to taste different food. When we choose a holiday destination, we go to very different places. You want to invest some money. The first things you ask your investors say, "Can I differentiate my portfolio because I don't want to risk too much?" So we are tendentially driven to diversity, but somehow that's something that blocks us in the business to accept diversity. And the main reason is because companies don't have the basic culture and DNA of acceptance of things that looks different, that create creativity and create potential change. So the first pillar that we found is that organizations need to have a culture of diversity and inclusion at a C-level engagement, real engagement that helps procurement organization to opens up those barriers to bring diverse suppliers. Then the way the procurement buyers can do that, well, they need to change competencies. You can't approach a small diverse business in a different countries from, that might have different resource assets and possibility in the same way you're approaching a big supplier. So buyers need to be more collaborative, more listener, more participative in the way they are approaching their suppliers. And what they have to do, they have to really create the opportunities for those diverse businesses to play in the company. So when they build their sourcing strategies, they consciously need to build a diverse sourcing opportunity in their strategies. In collaborating through an ecosystem, externally and internally, to be able to respond to the needs that the buyer company is. I mean, diverse businesses might not be able to answer to the entire bid completely, but if they work together, that's a possibility. So you need to incentivize that collaborations. And to do that, you need a structure and a governance, which is the other pillar, the fifth pillar, especially if you have a program which is across many countries with very different takes. You want your organization to be structured, to be governed in a way where decision-making is clear, you keep the pace of initiatives, and a diverse supplier can trust that what you promise is actually been happening because there's someone that ruled the process. And then the last two, well, you design a strategy, but you need to translate into a plan. Think about that like accepting a Paralympic athlete into a sport field. One thing is saying, hey, Paralympics can play. The other thing is saying, okay, you can access the field. But then a very different thing is, actually, this is your role that you can play in the team, and that's what you have to do. And that's where it comes to play the same way for buyers. They need to translate PowerPoint sourcing strategy is to concrete initiatives in their bidding processes and help diverse suppliers to develop and continuously improve. And then on those success stories, create communications that generate engagement, contribution, collaborations, and then you restart the cycle over and over again. It's a never-ending cycle that gets your organization to become more and more mature. And fundamentally, from a project, you create a mindset in the organizations that stands alone by itself. And the other thing that our study worked on is that we found companies at a very different level of this maturity journey and for whatever reasons, but they are at a different stage of maturity. And we found with Wendell, we found some very interesting examples into that.
Yeah, and so we've been doing this research, like mentioned, for the last year, and we've talked to and studied many companies, and it's really cross industries, cross geographies. And when we think about having to mature against those 7 pillars, it takes a lot of work, and we found many that were sort of at the first stage, which is at this level of establishing a program, and they're just kind of meeting government requirements or complying to what they need to comply to. Very little promotion or communication, and they haven't gotten to the point where there's true C-suite involvement. Now, going through the stages where they start to establish, then they start developing. We've got a kind of a foundational stage where they're getting better, and they're starting to get more engagement and more communication. So the consumer knows what it is. They're starting to hear that there are these diversity programs, and then they expand. Our final maturity stage is the stage of really embedding these programs within your organization, and it's really kind of disrupting the way that you think about these diversity programs. It's no longer the 7 categories or 6 categories of being diverse. It's now, where can we get the best talent, and where can we get the most innovation, and looking at things a different way. And there were, I would say, of the 40 some or 50 some that we have talked to, there were probably 2 that I would classify maybe in this very, very mature stage. And they've taken and embraced really those 7 pillars and translated that into the entire organization is focused on or marching to the same strategy that was set by the C-level suite. So it's interesting to see what they've done. Some of the other things, those that are more mature, really have put technology around it, and really they're more transparent about their programs, and they can monitor and measure. And so there are a lot of really positive things, but it can't, it's not free. I think Don mentioned that, it's hard sometimes to say you need to make this big investment, but we're going to talk a little bit later about the relationship of economic inclusion to sustainability. And so we'll talk more about that ROI and how you can get the ROI out of these programs. So just know that as Andrea was talking about those pillars, you can talk about this wonderful culture and such, but even the culture matures over time, and thinking about it, it's like, well, somebody says it's a good idea, and then that's sort of where it starts. But that matures over a period of time until you reach the point where you really are being disruptive, and you really have these programs completely embedded with your organization. And as we talk specifically about the ROI, there's a lot of very positive things that come out of this. So it's not all about investment, because you do get a return on these programs. So, so Don, I keep wanting to hear about your experiences, because you have a lot of experience with leading companies and really some more mature companies. And do you think, or have you seen some of these leading companies doing anything different to sort of accelerate this economic inclusion model?
But it's sort of the old axiom, right? You reward what you measure. If all you're doing is measuring, a report to the government, there's not much effort there. And I do see those companies, as you allude to, who really have embraced this, who've taken this seriously. It's not just a policy statement. It's not just a media, byline. It's actually embedded down into the local strategies. It's embedded into product development. It's embedded into sales strategies. They've taken it and looked at it not just as a supplier diversity kind of specific demographic statement, and looked at it as a resilience, looked at it as a risk, looked at it as an opportunity. And those that have really embraced this at that level, in some respects, they're not even going to talk to you about it, because they see it as a competitive advantage. They're able to get board support. They're able to demonstrate this level of, flexibility that is now responding in the marketplace, whereas others are still trying to react. And I think when you see companies that are truly leading edge on that, take the strategy, take it down to an executable level, measure and goal people against that, and truly make it part of their job function. We've all alluded to the talent, the race for talent on this, really training people to think beyond just the price point. In fact, I think a price point becomes the wrong mindset. Nobody's saying you should spend more money. What we're saying is that you should still get a reasonable price, but also add in these other factors as you evaluate the capabilities of these suppliers in the marketplace. And I think we've all lived these different levels of being evaluated. And when I see really, truly mature companies, cost is a criteria, but it is not the only criteria. They're really looking at the companies that they're working with, their vision, their roadmap, their investment in theirs. And we talk about it internally at Deloitte as, supply chain visibility, that supply chain sustainability we said earlier, but truly second level, third level, fourth level down of how are you embedding yourself into your system, into your ecosystem, and being able to see all of that resiliency there. That's diversity. That's the ability. And when companies are doing that, you are seeing significant strides in the market. When you're not, you're seeing companies react to events that they couldn't anticipate. And that's what we're seeing now. And while the pandemic definitely accelerated that, even beforehand, we were seeing companies invest in that level of visibility and that level of control and flexibility, because they saw themselves having to react before, and that was much more costly than investing up front. And to me, this is also an opportunity cost. What's the cost if you don't do it? Going forward, what's the blowback in the market? What's the reaction of your customers if you don't invest? As much as we talk about the cost of doing it, the cost of not doing it is going to outweigh that over time.
And I think there's also the aspect of investors' company looking on the same level at profitability and social and environmental investments. So those are becoming now one more important than the others, but are equally important into the judgment of your business. And that's an equation that CFOs can't forget. And then they turn into supply chains and procurement to say, okay, make sure that both these two things work together nicely, because that's how we're getting evaluated by the entire world.
And I would come back to the old axiom again with procurement is, where's the greatest value of the team? Is it at the end where you try to negotiate the price down at the last minute, or is it upstream when you're helping plan? I think the diverse supply chain view of this is even more now pronounced as getting involved upstream with the engineers, getting upstream with product planning, upstream so people can include those aspects into their plans versus trying to find it at the back end.
Yeah, and Don, you've made a really good point, and actually there is research on this issue, but it costs more if you wait and you're just one of those sort of followers, and eventually you're going to do it because you have to comply or something. It will cost you more to be that way than if you choose to invest in these programs up front. So just thinking about that, we really need to start saying, how can we put these programs together?
Great. Thank you for that perspective. There's a lot of great content here, but we're going to move on to the return on investment and how you might go about calculating that. So your research has been looking at sustainability for a long time. What are some similar challenges organizations are facing around supplier diversity return on investment? Is there any difference? And if some of you can maybe talk about some similarities and differences.
So since I've been researching probably the longest on this call, I'll talk about it first. And it's really interesting questions because I've seen many of the same challenges with other sustainability related programs. For an example, in the environmental space, sometimes it takes a lot of upfront investment to get suppliers engaged in these environmental efforts and teach them how to use materials differently and show them ways that they can improve on the environment, do some developmental activities. But the long run, the payback might not be the very next day, but the long run is you're basically going to get some better products, but you have to invest in that. I've been at organizations that claim to be lean, and they say, anything that's a lean project to reduce waste is really an environmental project. But in these lean shops, if you said, I'm going to do this lean project, it's fine. However, if you said, I've got this great environmental project, then you had to build the business case for it for the same exact thing. So it just took more time to get justified on the environmental part, even if it was the same project. So the ROI could take a bit longer to realize, but ultimately the benefits for the organizations, suppliers, and the environment are greater. So Andrea and I just finished up a white paper on procurement's involvement in sustainability initiatives. And as we were researching this for this white paper, and again, we talked to a lot of different companies, we realized that there were a lot of similarities with what we had been doing on the economic inclusion front. That really, I mean, the 7 pillars are a great example. Those 7 pillars or 7 competencies is how I usually address them, are necessary in any initiative that you really want to take and embed within your organization. And in the case of sustainability initiatives, they still mature over those phases. And we found there are many companies that are just worried about the compliance aspect, and in typical in research, these are the followers, and they're pushed to do something simply because they're coerced into doing that. Well, customers today are saying, sorry, not good enough. We have to do more than that, more than just comply. So there's different, these pillars are important to understand what kind of things fall under the pillars, what kind of competencies or capabilities, understanding that it is a process that has to mature, and it takes senior level involvement to say this is what matters, and it takes a lot of integration across the organization. In the environmental space in particular, I can't tell you how many organizations basically say that the procurement area and the CSR area don't even have a conversation. So they don't even talk to each other. So the strategies set by the company in the CSR area are not what's being tactically executed on. And same here with the supplier diversity, except in this case, I think some of that is set at the tactical level. And then, it's not even mentioned in the CSR reports, or maybe there's a few mentions. So there's a lot of similarities. From this research on sustainability, it was very interesting to me. One company that was very advanced in their sustainability programs, and that it also includes their economic inclusion programs. They actually had people in procurement that were their jobs were basically to be these black belts, almost like within lean programs, but they were black belts, and they would basically know everything there is to know about the process, about how things are happening, about what needed to change. They knew about all the materials, but these were procurement employees. And again, if you're talking about something that's completely embedded, you have to, as Don said, what gets measured gets managed. You've got to have these measurements, and you've got to have these metrics for everyone. It can't just happen, that somebody gets I guess I maybe shouldn't say this, but somebody gets a bigger bonus because the procurement people maybe did a good job in hitting their diversity numbers. But I mean, everyone needs to have these metrics. And sustainability, I can't tell you how many times they say, oh yeah, we want to be involved. And I'm like, is it on your scorecard? And absolutely not. It's like you hear crickets, in the room, because we're not measuring. We don't know what to measure. And when you start to talk about suppliers, and what do you do for those suppliers? It's even more complicated because, again, we don't know what the right thing is to measure. And with the economic inclusion, thinking about okay, so should we just go and say if it's 51% women owned, then it's considered a diverse business? And you look around the business and there's not a single other woman that's working there or is on the board. That to me something is misaligned. So we have to think about those metrics and what makes sense, and to say this is what we need from you from a supply chain perspective, and also from an internal perspective. So with the economic inclusion, we need to get away from our US centric classification model, similar to sustainability, where we need to start thinking about what are the implications across the supply chain in sustainability. Own it, own those scope 3 emissions, or who does own those. So I see a lot of similarities between the two. And the more I think about it, I really think economic inclusion is just, in my mind, it's a portion of when you start to think about the social impact of the triple bottom line. I usually kind of classify that there, but knowing that there's more return on investment than just social improvement. So that was probably a long-winded answer, and I apologize, but I get really invested in research. So Mike, I mean, you've been really involved in kind of helping us to quantify, or to put at least some figures in place and some calculations in place for this ROI. I can talk all day long about what I think are the benefits, but what do you think? What are some of your direct benefits you've run into, the indirects, and maybe other things that you've seen as you're working on this? What's my return?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, as you mentioned, Wendy, how to calculate actually the benefits is not an easy task, right? So I think probably many companies or personally are struggling how I can actually quantify this. So I think that's where, as Wendy mentioned, we have been on this journey long enough to really seek out many different ways how we really can quantify this ROI. So eventually we can have to take probably or segmented approach. We can categorize that first on the benefits. So within the actual benefits, we try to categorize what are actually the immediate benefits we can see or caused by a setup of an investment for economic inclusion program or supply diversity program. So I think that's where the tangible impact or benefits many companies they generally will see, and then that's easy to quantify, easy to identify. So give a specific example, as we all know, as part of the sourcing process, how much money you actually can save by award the business to a diversified supplier. Well, I mean, diversified supplier here is a broader definition, as Wendy mentioned, right? Not just the US standard. And then I think, Don also mentioned that, as part of the, trend, we have to actually take sourcing procurement, up front, right? So to be part of the early process, to be part of the engineers, to be the process, the product. And then that's actually part of the benefits when economic inclusion or diversified supplier, they can bring innovations, all these advanced technology on the table for you to think about your product roadmap. That's actually a very tangible benefit you can quantify. So that's the first bucket. And then on the second bucket, that's what we call it's an indirect benefits that actually caused by some of the non-controllable factors of the economic inclusion program. So I know that probably you think about what is actually that. So give a special example, as I mentioned, if we are actually going to have a much a stronger brand as inclusion company or diversified supplier company, that's actually going to get a lot interest from the end customer who cares more about a diversified environmental friendly the future. So that will attract more and more the customers to buy your product. That's actually part of what we call the potential revenue growth for the new customer, which are generated because you're doing this economic inclusion program that the other competitors are not doing. As John mentioned, right? Don mentioned this is actually part of the early adopter benefits, that's like, part of the strategy from the execution piece you can bring on the table. So the last part, it's kind of like, a little bit more broader. Think about like a halo effect. We have done a great job to set up the economic inclusion program. We kind of like, bring that to life. And then that's what we call the induced benefits. So the induced benefit is basically, what we have done differently, and then what is actually the potential chain effect down the road to change the whole society. So give example, what is actually the, average house income increase because we are attracting new customer, and then that's result in like a new job created, for manufacturing, for supply chain, and that's going to change a whole area, their overall like economic situation. So that's like another example. What we have to think more broadly, not just like think about what is actually in front of your eyes, but you have to think about all that's broader benefits can bring on the table. So I think those are the ways, as Wendy mentioned, we are trying to categorize that and then quantify the benefits. But absolutely on the cost side, generally it's a fairly straightforward. As I mentioned earlier, there's cost like from the talent investment, from the infrastructure investment, communication, as well as a supplier like a training program to get your supplier settled in. So I think that's like where definitely it will be a challenge journey. There will be like still kind of like ongoing refinement of the ROI calculation. That's how we capture the benefits, capture the cost, and then try to come up with the ROI. Yeah.
And that, Mike, to complement what you were saying, I think on the last aspect of calculating the induced benefit is where procurement is normally getting the most of the challenge from CFOs, because it's less tangible, and you can, that's where the challenges and the credibility lies. So what we came up with that is we use a theoretical model to back that social ROI aspect, which is the theory of the change model, which is basically fundamentally based on the principle of cause effect. And to measure that, what you need to identify is think who are the stakeholders that you impact through the change. So in the case that Mike was describing, if I'm creating jobs, who are the population in which I'm creating jobs? And then how much job I'm creating. So how deep the level of change I'm generating is, and how sustainable that change is. And then to be on the safe side, what that theory says, that you need to create some cautioning factors in, so discounting factors in, and say, okay, is that all these benefits are generated because of my change, or some of them would have happened anyway? And if yes, how much? It is only me as a buyer that I've generated that much job, but that would be great. It might not be the case. There might be other components, so I need to discount that. And then the last one is, am I generating some jobs with supplier A, but then I'm stealing those jobs from supplier B? So it's just kind of a cannibalization effect. And then the last one can be one-off. So I'm creating jobs for 1 year and then everything is gone. So there's no sustainable change in there. So it's kind of a missed opportunity. Or is it enduring change? That's really what economic inclusion is targeting. And therefore, yeah, I can count that because it's lasting and generate income increase, generate more taxable base, generate more social investment possibilities. So those are the kind of aspects that we put in this kind of a formula, if you want to move from the theoretical base to more pragmatical and operationalize those ROI calculations.
Thank you all for that great content. We're getting close to time, but Wendy, I know your study isn't ending here. Could you just give us some brief early thoughts on your next steps?
Yes, so Matt, my research never ends, which is, I guess, a good thing. And this economic inclusion journey, for me, it's been like being on a high-speed train. I had absolutely no idea how much interest there was in research in this area. There had been very little done really for the past 10 years. There had been very little research done on even on supplier diversity. So it was kind of interesting, but now it seems like the phone's constantly ringing and people want to understand how to put these programs in place and how to make them where they're they're not just about this US centric model, but how can we really have these embedded programs within our organization. So as we move into the coming years, that's where we'll start to go. I should say year, because Andrea will go, nothing takes that long. So we've been really working hard on defining this economic inclusion and supplier diversity. We are right now in the middle of a manuscript revision for a purchasing journal right now, trying to get information out there in the press. We are still working with Deloitte, as we've talked about today, to refine the ROI story, and we hope that we can actually test this ROI model and somehow, but I don't think we've gotten to that point yet. We are looking at performing an epic analysis of different geographies, because one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, well, okay, so where should we go next, or where should we go first as we make this journey? And so we're coming up with the way to sort of define that process. Where will I have the best impact, either socially, if that's a choice, or economically, if that's another choice, but what geographies look best? And we'll be up to, we've been analyzed with our model that we developed. We're going on to 75 countries. So that'll be really interesting to share at one point. So like I said, we're planning to test, we've been doing lots of lecturing and presentations to get the word out, and we will continue to do that. This fall, we've launched a sustainable supply chain course at the undergraduate level at UT, and economic inclusion and diversity is part of the curriculum. Our students they're so eager to learn about anything related to sustainability, anything related to diversity, and they actually are looking to organizations now, as they're getting hired, looking to organizations that sort of, tick these boxes of you're doing the right thing. And so that'll be really interesting to see how they interact with that program. We're working on actually developing a sort of academy for the diverse suppliers, because one of the things that we found in our research is that they lack really business acumen, or in our words, the supply chain part of their business is very challenging. So we're looking to see if we can get support from large organizations to send us some of their very small, diverse suppliers, and see if we can help them to be better partners. So we have a lot going on, and there's research now related, taking this diversity initiative related to base of the pyramid or disadvantaged geographies, and working with suppliers there. So I could go on, and Matt, I know you only gave me a few seconds to answer this, but I would add more. There's a lot of opportunity, and if people are there in the audience that would like to discuss these topics more, and I'll talk for myself and I'll talk for Andrea as well, but we're always happy to engage in those discussions. So just let us know.
And I'm happy to be a proxy for that. If you want to follow up with the researchers, just send an email to research@ascm.org, and then I can help bridge the discussion. And on that, because there's so much good content, we only have time for one question. And I found one good one in the chat line here. And that is, now supply chain sustainability is a board level discussion and focus. Supplier diversity reporting is key focus area for many US-based companies. What's your recommendation to convince with my company leadership to invest or shift in the focus to be a broader economic to take a broader economic inclusion supplier diversity focus? It's a good question.
So what we've seen in the boardrooms are a greater level of external board pressure to demonstrate the social side of this. I think it can't be understated that where you have the longstanding investors from the mutual funds who are looking just for the returns, even they are shifting their focus to having a more economically inclusive strategy in their investment approach. And that's influencing how the boards themselves are addressing it. There have been many times during this dialogue where we could have shifted the conversation and said, this is a move from a quarter to quarter strategy to a long-term investment portfolio. I think that's exactly where these boards are going. The boards themselves are starting to look beyond just the latest return. And the equity markets themselves are also, if you take a look at where the rewards are, you're seeing a lot of companies being rewarded for longer term strategies. The people are putting their investments there, knowing that it's not going to pay off next year, but it's going to take, as Dr. Tate said, several years to get there, but they are buying into the vision and the roadmap. And I think that's where the boards are really pivoting their influence and what they're looking to see from leadership as far as what they're investing in.
Great, thank you so much. Again, because there was so much good content here, we are out of time. If you have a question that you really wanted to ask, please send it to research@ascm.org. I will forward it on to the panel to answer your question. And again, as Dr. Tate mentioned, if you want to get in touch and discuss their research more in depth or participate in some form or another in their research, again, research@ascm.org, easy to remember. But that would be the end of today's webinar. I want to thank this amazing panel for their endless golden content. And thank you all for joining and for participating.